I'll do that. Yeah, just to let everyone know that I'll be recording the meeting. So if you don't want your face to appear, then you just turn off your camera. So as I was saying, my name is Francis. I'm the co-chair of the Pan-African Workers Association. And we agreed that one of the things that we agreed as a committee is that we need to introduce an educational series to talk about broad topics from politics, economics, and history to general issues about life in the UK, because we think that, there are some knowledge gaps, and for us to understand and to organize better, we need to have, a better theoretical foundation. We need to teach each other. We need to spend time in discussion groups like the one that we're having today, where we'll be discussing broad topics, including how trade unions emerged, including the role of trade unions in our societies, including, why we often feel as if we often feel the way we feel at work. We feel like work is burdensome. Sometimes we don't feel like there's much, value in some of the works that we do, or sometimes we feel like we're just going to work to earn a living. So today, there's no better person to start the first series than Comrade Ian Beddowes. Comrade Ian Beddowes was born in Birmingham, and he worked as a builder in Britain, and was involved in the builder strike in the 1970s. I think when he then eventually left the UK to go and join the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, and he's an MK veteran, Umkhonto weSizwe, to be more specific. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Comrade Ian Beddowes, who today is going to talk to us broadly about capitalist society. Where does the society that we have come from? Has this society that we live in has always been there? What is the role of Africa under the sun? What has you will start to go also into broad aspects of colonialism, the struggles against colonialism, and I hope that this will allow us to start to make connections between why we have left our home countries to be, for example, here in the diaspora. So, Comrade Ian Beddowes, over to you. Please, the best idea to engage is to use to be with an open mind, ask a lot of questions, and we hope to have a brilliant discussion. Over to you, Comrade Beddowes. I will also maybe share my screen if you want, but go for it.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Comrade Francis. I put it down as a series of 10 different classes, but it's not just me talking at people. People must come in with their views and their questions. So the first one, let me just tell you what will be. The first one will be capitalist society. What is capitalist society? Then part 2, which are split into 2A and 2B, is how did the capitalists make their initial capital, what we call the primitive accumulation of capital. It's a very nasty theme, and we split it into 2 parts. Then we're going to go into what is money? Where does money come from? We're going to deal with that. Then we're going to talk about surplus value. What is surplus value? How is profit made? Then we're going to go on to what is imperialism. From imperialism, we're going to go to what is neocolonialism. And these terms you probably heard, but you may not know exactly what they mean. What's neocolonialism? What's neoliberalism? Why is the United States ruling the whole world virtually through both militarily and economically? And why right now is it starting to go down in power? So that's another important topic. Then finally, what we're going to look at is the current world situation. What is happening in the world today? Because at the moment, we're going through a period of major change. US domination is disappearing. What is coming in its stead? Where do we, especially in Africa, how do we deal with the new situation? So that's going to be the series. So in this series as well, you've got this problem where Africans often think that Europe has always been the center of everything. That is not true. So some of you may have had the flyer already, part 1, which is called Capitalist Society. And I'll read through it. Capitalism has not always existed. It is a mode of production and a form of class society first became dominant in Britain about 200 years ago. Then emerged in other European countries, the USA and Japan, and spread from there, often through imperialist military conquest by the major capitalist countries. Class society has not always existed. Our species, Homo sapiens, has, according to scientific research, been around for about 200,000 years. For most of that time, people were hunter-gatherers who shared what they had in common. We call this stage of development primitive communism. Even today, there are still small groups of people who live like that. Civilization, and that using the technical term, the scientific term, people living in settled communities, initially in river valleys suitable for the cultivation of crops, grew up around 10,000 years ago. So people have been around for around 200,000 years. Human beings, not pre-humans, but actual human beings like us, have been around for about 200,000 years. And the first civilizations are only about 10,000 years old. So it tells you that we lived a long time as hunter-gatherers before we started having civilization and settlement. And even then, it wasn't the whole world. The 4 centers where this began were Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates, what is now Iraq and eastern Turkey. The second one is the Nile Valley of Egypt. The third one is the Indus Valley, which is now in Pakistan, but on the Indian subcontinent. And the fourth one is the Huanghe Valley in China. These civilizations grew up independently of each other, but all on river valleys where you could have settled agriculture. Once there was settled agriculture, people built houses, they put a little inset. And I also want to point out that civilization grew up independently in the Americas. But these were destroyed in the 15th and 16th century by European colonization. And we've got the Aztecs in Mexico, the Incas in Peru, those are the most famous. They therefore only played a very limited role in world historical development. But nevertheless, the people of these civilizations were skilled farmers and provide the world with maize, potatoes, tomatoes, pumpkins, chilies, cacao, chocolate, vanilla, pineapples and turkeys, among some other things, guava and avocado as well. Civilization spread out from these 4 main centers, but as production grew, social classes formed. Hello, I'm just...
We can hear you, Comrade. Go ahead.
You can hear me because I heard something in the background. Okay.
Yeah, that's people joining. Never mind, that's people joining. So, yeah.
Oh, that's good. Okay. Civilization spread out from these 4 main centers, but as production grew, social classes formed. As production increased, it became possible for a group of people who produced nothing themselves to live off the production of others. Now, the most primitive form of class society was slave society. One population group would capture another group and make them slaves. People became the property of other people. The slaves would do the work while their captors enjoyed luxury. At first, slaves came either from those who had fallen into debt or from people defeated in war. Later, people were born into slavery for generations. In ancient Greece and Rome, the majority of people were slaves. We sometimes hear about ancient Greek democracy. It was a democracy among slave owners. The slaves, the majority, didn't have any vote. Only the slave owners had a vote. Now, because of the notorious slave trade between Africa and the Americas, which began in the 16th century, the 1500s, and continued into the 19th century, that's the 1800s, some people think that only Africans have ever been slaves. This is not true. Historically, slavery has existed in many different parts of the world, and people from all ethnic and racial groups have been enslaved. The other form of class society before capitalism was feudalism. The lord or chief owned the land, and the ordinary people, the serfs, had to pay rent to either work on his land for a certain amount of time or by giving the lord or the chief a portion of what they produced. The lord or chief would in turn pay tribute to the king. That's the basics of feudal society. In all class societies, one class does the work, another enjoys others have produced. In all forms of obtain its rule by a special body of rule of the judiciary. This liberal capitalist states, therefore, we have what we call the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, the dictatorship of the capitalists, because the laws are skewed to their side. Most of the time, the ruling class uses more subtle means to maintain its rule. Most importantly, through false or distorted information on the media. And people must understand that. Most of the news they receive is distorted or in some cases completely fabricated. Most people, most of the time, turn accept the form of society in which they have grown up as normal or natural, even when it is obviously unjust or even dysfunctional. But when a ruling class fails to maintain the dominance of its ideas, it becomes a problem for it. When a ruling class has to resort to direct force to assert its rule, as happens frequently in many African countries, it is because it is finding it difficult to maintain its rule in any other way. Capitalist production grew out of individual production of feudal times. The typical feudal form of production was production for local consumption. Food, clothing, and other articles were produced by the serfs for themselves and for their feudal lord. With the development of a surplus, that is, more articles than the particular group needed, the surplus was sold in exchange for articles produced elsewhere. When most of what was produced was for sale to other people, we have the beginning of commodity production. So in early societies, people produced for their own use. As we come into capitalism, and even before capitalism, we have commodity production, where most of what people produce is in order to be sold or exchanged for things produced by others. Mercantile capitalism began to appear. That is, merchants would buy commodities produced by others and sell elsewhere. The producers would normally be self-employed artisans, or in other cases, the merchant would buy surplus agricultural produce from the lord or chief. Capitalist production, in the true sense, appeared when people had no other means to sustain themselves other than by selling their labor power for a wage. In other words, they no longer had land, or at least not enough land to maintain themselves. So therefore, in order to survive, they had to work for someone, sell their labor power for a wage. In capitalist production, the capitalist owns the building machinery and the raw materials. The worker does not sell his labor. This is a mistake you hear from some trade unionists. He sells his labor power. It is the capitalist who sells the labor of the worker, and the labor of the worker is there in whatever he produces. So it's important to understand that difference. He sells his ability to work. The capitalist sells the labor or the product of that labor, which is there within whatever the workers produced. I really want to emphasize that. The capitalist sells the commodities at their value when compared to other commodities, but the worker will be paid only enough for him or her to survive. The difference between the value of the product and the wages of the worker we call surplus value, and we'll deal with that more in future. That is where the profit of the capitalist comes from. The tradition from feudalism to capitalism, the world's first capitalist country, took some centuries. And I make a note that mercantile capitalism and even actual capitalism developed in northern Italy, but because, even before Britain, but because Italy was divided into a lot of small states at that time, it was not united till 1861. A fully capitalist country never developed in those early stages. Right. Now, some of you are in Britain. The PAWA is based in Britain. So you should know what happened with the growth of capitalism in Britain. In 1485, King Henry VII took power at the end of the Wars of the Roses, in which rival factions of the aristocracy, the feudal lords, killed each other off. Henry was a very practical man, and he then began to use accounting methods which had developed in Italy to keep control of the money of the state. More importantly, Henry appointed a new aristocracy to take the place of those who no longer existed. Many of these, instead of on in the way, through the serfs off, which they sold as a commodity even outside England. England is, by the way, England and Scotland were separate kingdoms until 1603. In the famous satirical novel Utopia, written in 1616, Thomas More had this to say: "Your sheep that were wont to be so meek and tame and so small eaters become so great devourers and so wild that they eat up and swallow down the very men themselves. They consume, destroy, and devour whole fields, houses, and cities. For look in what parts of the realm doth grow the finest and therefore dearest wool, where noble men and gentlemen, not contenting themselves with the yearly revenues and profits that were wont to grow to their forefathers and predecessors of their lands, nor being content they live in rest and pleasure, leave no ground for tillage. They enclose all into pastures, they throw down houses, they pluck down towns, and leave nothing standing." So that was written in the early 16th century. But it was not until the Reform Act of 1832, which gave the vote to property owners in the cities, and not to workers or to women, by the way, that the industrial capitalist class gained political power, 1832. Now, I'm making that a point because people say, oh, socialism was tried and failed. Capitalism took a long time to develop out of feudalism. And there was revolution and counter-revolution. So in Britain, the first proper capitalist country, the first part of the capitalist revolution was in 1485. But it wasn't until 1832 that finally the industrial capitalist class really had power over the land. Early capitalism was terrible. After the people had lost their land, they had no option to work than in the factories in conditions of awful poverty. Working hours of 16 hours a day with only Sunday off were not unknown, and child labor from the age of 7 was common. It was really a bad time. People think in Africa they were exploited. The early part of the 19th century in England, if you read the stories, it was horrific. In many parts of the country, the life expectancy was below 40. And I think in one place, I remember reading in Dudley, life expectancy reached 18 at one stage. But the working class fought back through the formation of trade unions and through political organizations like the Chartists, the first sort of modern revolutionary organization in England called the Chartists. They had the People's Charter. They fought for the right to vote of the workers. And they were quite willing to fight for that as well, not just to have demonstrations, but actually to go out, and they used to drill on the hillsides and be ready to fight the army. The relatively good conditions of the workers are not evolved gently. They're the result of bitter class struggle over a long period. I want to make that very clear to Zimbabwean and other African workers working in Britain, that the labor laws, which are relatively good and which can be maintained, were not given because the British ruling class are nice people. They have emerged out of 150 years or so of class struggle by the British working class. So let's now go on to Africa, history and conditions. So far, we have examined the historical development of class society and capitalism in the world and in Britain. Now we need to examine how capitalism has affected Africa. Firstly, although colonialism did enormous damage to Africa, we should not imagine that pre-colonial African society was idyllic. Sometimes some Pan-Africans say, oh, it was all wonderful before the whites came, whatever. Kwame Nkrumah, arguably the greatest of all Pan-African leaders, had this to say in African Socialism Revisited. He said, I won't read. He says, today the African socialism seems to espouse the view that traditional African society was a classless society viewed with the spirit of humanism and to express a nostalgia for that spirit. And he goes on to say, I'm afraid the realities of all events of European colonial devoid of sort of Africa before colonization, and feudalism involves a deep and exploitative social stratification founded on the ownership of land. It also must be noted that slavery existed in Africa before European colonization. And then he goes on, colonialism deserves to be blamed for many evils in Africa, but was not preceded by an African golden age or paradise. A return to the pre-colonial African society is evidently not worthy of the ingenuity and efforts of our people. So how did capitalism come to Africa? In 1884, 1885, the leaders of the contesting European capitalist countries came together in Berlin and divided Africa between themselves. Why in that date? Because capitalism had reached a monopoly stage. They want to expand. Now, as far as Africa goes, before 1885, for instance, we know in 1876, 11% of Africa was taken over by European powers. Mostly, it was trading centers. But by 1900, 90%, 11% in 1876, 90% in 1900. Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, Italy, and Spain were all beneficiaries, in roughly that order. Germany was forced to give up its colonies to other imperialist powers as a result of the First World War, 1914-1918. So Namibia Southwest Africa was a German colony for existence. Tanganyika also was a German colony. Africa had traded with the rest of the world for centuries. Europe, especially Portugal, Arabia, India, and China, traded with Africa. Gold, ivory, had long been trade items from the end of the 15th century. Now, the discovery, so-called, but more important, the colonization of the Americas by Europe led to the need for labor. In the middle of the 15th century, Portuguese traders had bought a few slaves from trades on the West African coast, but the Atlantic slave trade really took off during the second half of the 17th century. It should be understood that capturing the slaves was rarely carried out by Europeans, and that almost all slaves were captured by Africans of other ethnic groups and languages. So this thing of saying it's all the white guys is not true. Yes, they did a lot of very bad things, but African kingdoms actually were formed on the basis of the slave trade. For the purposes of understanding capitalism in Africa today, we should understand the slave trade was destructive to Africa in two ways. Firstly, in the quest for accumulating wealth quickly, the economies of those groups from which many were taken captive were seriously disrupted. In most cases, it was the most productive people who were taken into slavery. Secondly, those kings, merchant, and ethnic groups who benefit from slavery ignored production. Prior to the slave trade, West Africa had cities comparable, even better than those of Europe. They were, of course, developed because the people were industrious and well organized. This led to the development of the ruling elite. This problem then led to the development of a ruling elite interested in accumulating wealth through means other than organization and production. In southern Africa, Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, South Africa, Namibia, due to European settlement, developed local capitalist economies in which African people were forced into wage labor, usually unskilled. Very few Africans were given management experience. Now, as early as 1961, African writer Frantz Fanon had this in to the pitfalls of nationalist, the object of nationalism with slogans of independence, and for the rest, leave it to future events. When such parts of the question on the economic program of the state they are clamoring for, incapable of replying the country. African countries have suffered from bad management and failed to understand the real workings of their economies ever since. Adherence to irrelevant American or European textbook is still common, but the blocking, removal, or murder of our best leaders by the imperialist powers and their allies and leaving us with the worst has been the major reason for the continuation of neo-colonial domination by Europe and the USA. And here I'm finishing here because I want to mention people to those who are listening and see if they can tell us who they are. Nkrumah, Lumumba, Hani, Ngomo, Tongogara, Sankara, Gaddafi are just a few of those leaders blocked or removed with the direct or indirect intervention of the imperialist center. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Comrade, for that lovely presentation. Very, very informative. We will now invite people to ask some questions or clarifications. Anyone interested in asking a question? Anyone comments? Let's make it more engaging. Maybe I can break the ice a little bit. You mentioned something about capitalism starting in, did you say northern Italy? Do you want to just expand on that point a little bit? You know, how did the British take over? I mean, the far I understand is that capitalism had started in
Well,
Venice?
I think the reason for Britain developing more quickly was because of its geographical location and the borders. In most of Europe, there were, you see, England without Scotland, and Wales was conquered by the 13th century. So England was surrounded by water. Although they were at war with France on occasions, the wars in England were not so destructive as in the rest of Europe. So you had a permanent border from the time of King William I, William the Conqueror in 1066. There was a centralized state system, albeit a feudal system. In Italy, which was, although it had developed from the Roman Empire, it was split into numerous, especially northern Italy, which was more developed. Florence was a state, the papal states were a state, Venice was most important, Goa, what's the word, where Christopher Columbus came from? Genoa, sorry, not Goa, it's in India. Genoa, Venice, they were all separate states who often fought amongst each other. Florence was another major one. And although they were quite developed in many ways, the lack of unity prevented Italy from developing as a country. Italy only became one country in 1861. Germany also only became one country in 1871. So the political unity of England, which was then joined by Scotland in 1603, made it more stable, so capitalism was able to develop earlier. And as I say, the first thing in British, let's say the first product, major product exported by England was wool. And today, in the House of Lords, the Speaker of the House of Lords sits on something called the wool sack, because wool was the center of their economy. And even then, the development of capitalism takes several stages. After Henry VII came his son Henry VIII, who divorced the Church of England from the Roman Catholic Church, and therefore from control from Europe. Although there were some wars based, well, they weren't based on religion, they were based on class. The new aristocrats gained a lot of control, but the merchants didn't even like the new aristocrats and they fought against it. In 1640, there was the English Revolution started, where Parliament challenged the king. And in 1649, the revolutionaries actually executed the king. And what some people from Africa don't know is England was a republic for 11 years. And the president was known as Lord Protector of the Commonwealth. And by the way, Commonwealth is, the word Commonwealth today means a very strange thing, because the original word, the original meaning of Commonwealth was republic. So to have a Commonwealth which is led by a king doesn't really make sense in terms of the English language. So there were several stages in the development of capitalism in England. The Industrial Revolution started around 1760, and that led to and that happened at the same time as the English peasants were being driven off the land. So once they were driven off the land, they had to go work in the factories. That's how the English working class was founded. And by the way, most Africans, even if they work in the factories, they've still got a little piece of land. You know, I heard in Zimbabwe, oh, the white man took our land. Well, he left you with something. in Britain, the white man left us with nothing. We could only work in the factories. We didn't have, my father, neither my grandfathers, none of them owned their own houses. They lived in council houses because the British peasantry were driven off the land and made to become workers. So in Africa, it happened in a partial way, but not in a complete way. I just wanted to make that point.
Yeah, thanks so much for clarifying, comrade. Anyone with a question? Guys, don't be shy now, or to challenge whatever presentation, some elements of the presentation. Okay, just unmute yourself and ask a question or contribute.
I would like to. Could I ask people a question? I mentioned Nkrumah, Lumumba, Hani, Ngomo, Tongogara, Sankara, Gaddafi. Is there anybody here who can tell me who is Kwame Nkrumah and what was his importance in the African struggle?
That's a good question. Anyone wants to give it a go? There are no right or wrong answers, comrades. And obviously, it'd be good to hear what you think. Anyone? Yeah. Anyone, guys, who wants to attempt the question? Yeah, comrades, the people sometimes are a little bit shy, so hopefully they'll
okay, there should be some other Zimbabweans there. Can they tell me what's the importance of Ngomo and Tongogara?
Yeah.
Because this question is usually, yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's wait and see if someone comes through. The other question was more practical, really. I mean, we are doing this. Why is it important to know? For example, you've asked the question, why is it important for us to know about Nkrumah or the other leaders that you've mentioned? Why must we bother ourselves? Comrades can ask.
I think, yeah. Let them. Yeah, before I come
and just to also say, I think if you want to post your question in the chat box, then I can read it out as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Go ahead, comrade. Why is it important for us to know about, for example, Nkrumah, Nkomo, and all the other leaders that you mentioned? Yeah.
Right. Why I'm saying this is
important. History and all this history, why does it matter to us? Shouldn't we be worried about picking up the next shifts and, I suppose, making money, as they say?
Why are so many Zimbabweans and other Africans in Britain at present? What went wrong?
Well, they say corruption amongst our leaders, they've planned or sort of spend all the money, and so we don't have any more money. That's the usual thing that we hear.
Yes, well, in my presentation, yes, I didn't say our leaders were good. But if you study who were our best leaders, those who had a plan to develop the country, they were removed or even murdered. Because what the West wants from Africa is raw materials. They don't want us to develop industry. As we know, the Rhodesians developed small-scale industry. Our big exports, which I know you've written about, were minerals and tobacco. But we developed our own industry, and most of what, even going in the 1980s, most of what you bought in Zimbabwe was made in Zimbabwe. You had very good clothes made in Zimbabwe. You know, you could buy drinking glasses. You could name it. Even cars were were assembled in Zimbabwe. So there was 80 or 90% of what you bought was made in Zimbabwe. But what happened? The West, the British and the Americans advised us through Bernard Chidzero that we needed free trade, that we did not need state planning. And we'll go on this later. We call this the neoliberal, the neoliberal agenda. Everybody must become an entrepreneur. And we're going to go into this in more detail later. And especially we'll do a little bit on Zimbabwe, as more people are Zimbabweans, but similar happened in other countries in Africa. Now, I talk about Nkrumah because the first sub-Saharan African country to become independent was Ghana in 1957. And what did Nkrumah do? Ghana produces bauxite. What's bauxite? It's the ore for aluminium. When they export it, they semi-process it because it's bulky to, to send by itself. So they semi-process it in Ghana to what they call alumina, which is much lighter to carry. And that's where it stops. Nkrumah had started to have a vision to develop an aluminium industry in Ghana. And I haven't got time to go through all the details now, but he was deliberately undermined, and they concocted a coup against Nkrumah, which they all celebrated. And yes, Ghana now has got the beginning of an aluminium industry. And it was started about 3 years ago. If Nkrumah had been able to follow on by 1970, how many years ago was that? By 1970, Ghana would have had an aluminium industry, not 2020 or something like that. By 1970, Ghana would have had an aluminium industry, which would have challenged the West. So it was undermined. In South Africa, they murdered Chris Hani because he would have been the next president after Mandela. And he was not corrupt. He was a communist. He had a view of production, and he was taken out. In Zimbabwe, Ngomo, you always told you had this zebra army, which was Ndebele, and the Zadna army, which was Shona, and you had ZAPU was actually the original national political party. And people always get surprised when I tell them the actual history, that Dynamo's football club in Harare, which is always sort of Shona, ZANU, was actually formed by ZAPU, was a ZAPU project. So the fact is that Ngomo had help from the Soviets, and the right wing didn't like it, and the British organized ZANU to split away, and it was fortunate for them that Ngomo belonged to the Ndebele minority, which had never been a problem prior to that, because when Ngomo was elected to be the leader, the majority of people who were elected were actually Shona. So this whole Shona and Ndebele thing, which was a project by the British and the Americans to undermine the Zimbabwe liberation struggle. And although later Mugabe turned against the British and the Americans after 1998, in 1980, the British and the Americans supported Mugabe, and they said so. Because the Cold War was on, and Nkomo had vision, and he would have become the first president. And why we say Tongogara died, and there's a lot of different stories of how he died. They say, oh, he was sideswiped by a truck. But before that became the official story, there were about 4 different versions of how Tongogara died. But why did he die? We're pretty sure. Because he wanted the Patriotic Front to stand as one party, and he's on record of having said at the Lancaster House Conference that the first Prime Minister should have been Joshua Nkomo. Although Tongogara was the Zanda commander. So there's a lot of stuff which is hidden, tucked under in the history of Zimbabwe that most Zimbabweans are not even aware of. And then you just hear them say, oh, I don't want to talk to this one, he's a Shona, or they don't want to talk to this one, he's in the Ndebele. They don't even know where this hatred started.
Yeah.
And it wasn't there in the and I tell people that, and they can check it for themselves, that in the early days of the liberation movement, before it was fully formed, but the early leaders, from the strike in 1948, general strike in 1948, who was the leader was Benjamin Burombo, who was based in Bulawayo. Who was the main leader in Salisbury, now Harare? It was Charles Mzingeli, who was in the Ndebele. So today, it would be almost impossible to imagine a Shona leading the people of Bulawayo or Ndebele leading the people of Harare. But in 1950, it was there. That was actually happening. So people must understand this is why it's important to know the history. And the history must be based on the facts. Once we've got the facts, we can analyze the facts. That's what I'm trying to do through this history course.
Thanks,
to look
comrade.
at the basic. Yeah.
Thanks, comrade. Yeah, thanks, comrade. I'm just going to stop recording now. Maybe some people might be comfortable to ask questions, off the record. So your presentation will go up on YouTube, and then I'm just going to stop recording now, just in case people don't want them to be